Morning. All right, so how's everybody holding up? We're surviving, not scared. Everybody got enough toilet paper? I told the elders if we wanted to guarantee a big crowd this morning, if we'd have had a one roll per person giveaway, we'd have this building packed out with people. Yeah. By the way, as I look around, you know old people were supposed to stay at home, right? As I'll read that on the news? Okay.
Well, I just read an article coming to church that I almost turned around and went back.
Wow. That's right, yeah. Yeah, that did make me laugh. Somebody posted about social distancing, and I saw a video from Ingalls where people were just on top of each other, so yeah. So we'll, here we go.
Remember the church did this long thing. He said, God is a God of quarantine. That just shows that you can say anything about God, match whatever you want to say.
There we go.
And he went in about leper colonies. He's a God of quarantine.
Yeah. So I'll say this, and I'm going to say it again in a little while. Use common sense. Let's not greet each other with a holy kiss for a little while. Instead of hugs and handshakes, we can do these or these little elbow bumps or whatever. Most of us here are perfectly healthy, but there are people that we know and love that are at risk that we come into contact with. I have a wife who's 8 months pregnant, so I'm going to do my best to avoid situations. So use common sense, wash your hands, all those things, but we're not going to live in fear either. And so I'm glad that you're here. And amazingly, in the midst of all this, we're going to study the Bible this morning, if that's all right with y'all. So let's have a word of prayer together, and then we'll get into our class. Father in heaven, we thank you so much for this day, for our time together, for just the ability to be here. Lord, we come to you acknowledging the fears and the anxieties of the world, and we know that realistically there are a lot of people, including some of us, that are fearful, that are worried, that see the things on the news, and who've even debated whether or not we should be here today. But we thank you for the courage to assemble. We pray that we balance common sense with faith and that we can just get the most out of our time here together. Father, bless us. Bless those that are sick and hurting. Bless those who are scared. Just help us, Lord, to put our faith and our trust in you. It's through your Son we pray. Amen. All right, 1 Kings. By the way, it is an awkward time to have allergy issues right now, so if you hear me cough, I'm not running a fever, I'm not short of breath. I just hate pollen. So, give you that preface. Just to kind of recap some of the things that we talked about last week, of course, in 1 Kings, the prophets, not the kings, are actually the main characters. And I think we're going to see that play out. Maybe not in these first couple of chapters, but later on throughout the book. Another major theme is Israel struggles with idolatry. We know that the nation struggled in that regard, and even Solomon later on in life we're going to see struggle with that. And then I think in this book we're going to see God's grace juxtaposed with his wrath. That back and forth there's going to be these pictures of the beauty of God's grace, and then also we're going to see the fury of his anger in the book. And so those are some things just to watch out for as we go through this. And I don't want to spend too much time rehashing things that we talked about last week, but just if we go back and we remember, we open the book with the story of David and Abishag. Anybody remember what was going on with David and Abishag? Yes, so part of the story is that he had gotten older. He was in a cold palace, and they went and found someone to lay with him to keep him warm. Is that the entirety of that story? What is, as Paul Harvey would say, the rest of that story? Well, before we get to that,
what it had to do with her being a virgin and not being able to perform.
yes, so Abishag was brought in. She was a beautiful young virgin that was chosen from all the women in the kingdom, and she was there to test the sexual fervor of King David, to see whether or not David could still act in that way, because in that day and time, royalty was expected to have that physical ability. And so once that David showed that he no longer had that ability, then that was the end of his time as king, and they started searching for a successor. And I know, and we mentioned this last week, that seems bizarre. That why would they be so worried about whether the king could do that? But we had a perfect illustration of this this week, and I know this is one of those things that you've all heard about ad nauseum, but Donald Trump came into contact with somebody who tested positive for coronavirus, and the entire world was absolutely screaming for him to do what? Go take a test. Why? Because he's old. Yeah. Because we want our leaders to have that health. And if he was somehow sick and indisposed, we'd be worried about the safety and security of our country. And some people were probably hoping for a positive test, and some are reassured because he tested negative. And so wherever you sit, I don't care where you sit politically, it's important to know that we have someone in charge who's capable physically. And, we talked about all the political leaders that have gone through and the things that they've done, with Barack Obama playing basketball and George W. Bush going jogging. We as the public were constantly reassured that our leaders were in good enough health. Well, for the nation of Israel here, it was King David that if he wasn't able to perform sexually with this young virgin, then he's no longer fit to be the king of the nation. And so that's when you start moving along. And then we got to this story of Adonijah. Adonijah decides, remember, he is what number of the king's sons? Number 4. Who was the first one? Amnon, right? What happened to Amnon? He died. He was murdered by who? By Absalom. Why? For the rape of his sister Tamar, Amnon and Tamar. And that's one of the darkest stories in the entirety of the Bible, and one of the things where I think we see David's frailty and weakness, which we'll see in a minute. And then the second son, we don't know what happened to him, but we assume he's dead at this point because we don't hear anything about him. Who was son number 3? Absalom. And Absalom, of course, was killed in battle. And who was the perpetrator of said killing? Joab. We're going to talk about Joab here in just a little bit. And so Adonijah sets himself up as king. What's the problem with that? Yeah, God had said Solomon was going to be king. So this is just a side note. I was going to spend more time on this, but I don't want us to get any farther behind than we already might be. And by the way, remember, next Sunday we'll all have combined Bible classes here, so we won't have our First Kings class. But there is an accusation made that was Bathsheba and Nathan scheming together, that David had actually not made that promise. And so when you go through the text, and this is, I think this is on page 37 in our book. By the way, I do have those books if you want one. The box, I'll set it. I'll set it somewhere. I'll set it on one of these back pews. So if you want to put some Purell on and grab one, and Purell again, you can get one of those books, and you can have that to follow along. They were misplaced for a couple days, but we found them. But on page, let's see. If you're following along, let's see here. Page 30, starting on page 31, in that second paragraph where it says a lot of scholarly ink has been spilled, there is that discussion, but it's pretty explicit in the book of Chronicles that 1 Chronicles 22 verses 9 and 10 and 1 Chronicles 28 verse 5, and then again in 1 Chronicles 23 verse 1 and chapter 29 verse 22, there's a discussion of Solomon taking over for David. So while it's not recorded in Samuel, the chronicler does take care of that for us. So it is pretty clear that David appointed Solomon to be his successor. And so then when Adonijah comes in, and I know this is a lot of history, but if you go through and read the text, it's a really, really interesting narrative. When Adonijah comes in, he's essentially a usurper. that this is a place and a time that belongs to Solomon, and Adonijah comes in and decides to take over. And so where we kind of left off last week, Nathan and Bathsheba had gone in to David and made David promise that he would appoint Solomon. And so as Adonijah is partying outside of town with his crew, right, he's sort of taken some of David's close-knit followers, and they've gone out and he's declared himself king. What does David do to Solomon to counter that? Anybody remember? He makes him king, and what does Solomon show up on to show that he's going to be the king? Yeah, he shows up on David's mule. He rides in, and he is pronounced king. And so when at the end of chapter 1, Adonijah is holding on to the horns of the altar. Now, why is he doing that? I think we mentioned this briefly last week. It says at the end that Adonijah is holding on to the horns of the altar. Yeah, that was a place of safety. That if you wanted to go and you wanted to, I'll try to describe it to you. How many of you have seen Pirates of the Caribbean, the movie? You remember what happens when a pirate gets captured but they don't want to die right then? What do they call for? Parley, right? And so that's the same thing. When you're there, you're safe, and you have an opportunity to go have an audience with those people that have captured you. And so Adonijah goes to Solomon, and he bows down and proclaims Solomon king, and so his life is spared. And so that's sort of where we are here at the beginning of chapter 2. And once again, we don't have the time to go through and read all this text. It's 50 verses, but this is a very important thing. And in the first 10 verses, we are going to read these. I think this is really important text. And so if somebody will volunteer for me to read the first 6 verses, 1 Kings chapter 2, 1 through 6, nice and loud for me.
When David's time to die drew near, he commanded Solomon his son, saying, I'm about to go the way of all the earth. Be strong and show yourself a man, and keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways, and keeping his statutes, his commandments, his rules, and his testimonies, as is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do, and wherever you turn. That the Lord may establish his word that he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons pay close attention to their way, to walk before me in faithfulness, with all their heart, with all their soul, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. Moreover, you also know that Joab the son of Zeruiah did to me how he dealt with the 2 commanders of the armies of Israel, Abner the son of Ner, and Amasa the son of Jether, whom he killed, avenging in the time of peace for blood that had been shed in war.
Go ahead.
Lost my place.
Yeah.
Almost to the end. That had been shed in war, and putting the blood of war on the belt around his waist and on the sandals on his feet. And therefore, according to your wisdom, but do not let his gray head go down to Sheol in peace.
Okay.
So even as an old man, don't let him get by with this.
Yeah. Go ahead and read the rest of that too, if you don't mind, through verse 10.
Okay. But deal loyally with the sons of Barzillai, the Gileadite, and let him be among those who eat at your table, for with such loyalty they met me when I fled from Absalom your brother. And there is also with you Shimei the son of Gera, the Benjamite from Bahurim, who cursed me with a grievous curse on the day when I went to Mahanaim. But when he came down to meet me at the Jordan, I swore to him by the Lord, saying, I will not put you to death with the sword. Now therefore do not hold him guiltless, for you are a wise man. You will know that you ought to do, you will know what you ought to do to him, and you shall bring his gray head down with blood to Sheol. Then David slept with his fathers, was buried in the city of David. I guess that is funny.
Yeah,
I'm going
yeah.
between two different
Yeah.
electronic devices here.
So there's some interesting stuff in there. First off, imagine you going in, and I hope that you had this opportunity, or if you are like me and your dad's still alive, I hope you have this opportunity when your father is on his deathbed, that you get to go in and spend time and talk to him and get advice from him and spend some time with him. Also hope that his last instructions to you are not to go out and murder 3 people, as David's were to Solomon. I mean, that's a lot, right? Dad, are you sure you want me to kill all these old men? But I think there's significance to every one of these proclamations. But before we even get to that, and I think this is an important discussion, I did a lesson on this a couple Father's Days ago about parenting. And this is just some statistics about fathers. 63% of youth suicides are from fatherless homes. 90% of all homeless and runaway children are from fatherless homes. 71% of all high school dropouts come from homes without dads. And 85% of kids that are incarcerated come from homes without dads. So we know the importance, right, of being a parent, and specifically the ideas of fathers. And so when we think about David, I think that David's shortcomings in his life are twofold. Number one, the incident with Bathsheba. And when you go through and you read the history of David, the only thing that's really accounted to him, and the only negative that's ever mentioned about David, is the situation with Bathsheba. And that was a big one. But he was repentant, and he trusted God, and he was called a man after God's own heart. However, David struggled as a father. And I put these 3 things up here: that David didn't provide consequences, he didn't provide correction, and he didn't have any credibility. And starting with the incident with Amnon, he really had a hard time with all his children, with Amnon, with Absalom, and here with Adonijah trying to take the throne from him. And so I think that's one of David's weaknesses. I think David is the best king that's ever lived. I think David is indeed a man after God's own heart. I think David, it was the archetype for the coming of Jesus himself. So I'm not in any way demeaning or lessening the significance and the importance of David, but I love that the Bible gives us so much about him that we're able to see his human side and we're able to learn those lessons. And so I think there's a lot to be said about learning from David's shortcomings as a father. But this is his final advice, right? These 3 things that he tells him. And he says this sort of at the beginning of the text. Be strong and be a man. It's important for Solomon. Be strong and be a man, he tells him. Secondly, he says you need to obey God. That's obviously clear. And number 3, you need to lead your family. Now, is Solomon going to live up to these 3 things? Is he going to be a man? In the way that we think about masculinity, probably a little too much so, right? By the way, one of our little kids in the C Squad, after the lesson last Sunday, got in the car and said, "Mom, what's a concubine?" And so I'm glad that I didn't have to explain that. But, you go through and you see some of the mistakes he made. Did Solomon obey God? For a while, but especially in his old age, he didn't. Did he lead his family in the appropriate way? No, he didn't. And so a lot of this advice went unheeded. But I do find it interesting to read this discussion between David and Solomon. And really it goes through verse 12. But at the end there we see David. He rests with his ancestors. He's buried in the city of David. He had reigned 40 years over Israel, 7 years in Hebron and 33 years in Jerusalem. Of course, it was after that 7 years that he united the kingdom. So Solomon sat on the throne of his father David, and his rule was firmly established. Okay. So we see David's instructions to Solomon. Let's talk about the beginning of Solomon's reign a little bit. Starting in verse 13. It says, Adonijah, the son of Haggith, went to Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, and Bathsheba asked him, "Do you come peacefully?" He answered, "Yes, peacefully." Then he added, "I have something to say to you. You may say it." She replied, "As you know," he said, "the kingdom was mine. All Israel looked to me as their king." So has he completely let this go, that his throne was taken away? No, right? He's still holding on to it. And this is about to create a huge problem. He says, "But things change, and the kingdom has gone to my brother, for it has come to him from the Lord. Now I have one request to make of you. Do not refuse me." "You may make it," she said. So he continued, "Please ask King Solomon, he will not refuse you, to give me Abishag the Shunammite as my wife." Now, do you see any problems in that request? Who is Abishag the Shunammite? Yeah. Now, outside of the sheer awkwardness of that request, why would that be problematic for him to ask for Abishag as his wife? I think maybe that's part of it. I don't think that Abishag was ever a wife of David, so I don't think that would have applied. But there is an important thing to draw from that. Let's go back to the story of Absalom. When Absalom ran David out of Jerusalem, and Absalom took over and came in and declared that he was the king, what was one of the things that he did very publicly that humiliated David? Yeah. He slept with his concubines. Did he do it in private? No, he did it in public. By the way, you think society is wild now? Go back and look at ancient society. That he went in as the king and publicly slept with his father's concubines. You're not going to see that in any episodes of The Crown, I'm pretty sure. But when he did that, that was utter humiliation for David. And so Adonijah comes in and says, "Well, I'm not the king, but what if I have Abishag as a wife?" And he says, and he goes to Bathsheba and tells her to go and ask Solomon that. Let's keep reading a little bit. There's a couple other things I want to say. When Bathsheba went to King Solomon to speak to him for Adonijah, the king stood up to meet her, bowed down to her, and sat down on his throne. He had a throne brought for the king's mother, and she sat down at his right hand. Now, you just have to bear with me for a minute. I don't ever read about any other mothers of the king where the king bowed to her and then had a separate throne brought in to sit at his right hand. What is the biblical image of sitting at the right hand of the king? Who's sitting at the right hand of God? Yeah, it's a place of honor. And throughout all antiquity and in modern times, as we read the Bible, that is a huge place of honor. So what does that tell us then about Bathsheba? I think that's part of it, that he loved her. But what does it say about her place in society in general? I feel like personally that she was David's prized, I don't want to use the word possession because that's a bad word to use, but for all intents and purposes, she was the pride of David's life. That from the situation that happened, even though it was adultery and murder, all that was involved, that because of David's repentance and because of his love for her, she became a symbol of David's kingship. And so after David dies, Bathsheba is still, his number one wife, and she's the mother of the king. And so she, by the entire society and by Solomon himself, is given this great place of honor. I think that's pretty significant for her in this story. So she goes in and she says, "I have one small request," this is verse 20, "to make of you." She said, "Do not refuse me." The king replied, "Make it, my mother, I will not refuse you." So she said, "Let Abishag the Shunammite be given in marriage to your brother Adonijah." King Solomon answered his mother and said, "Why do you request Abishag the Shunammite for Adonijah? You might as well," and this is what Lloyd alluded to a minute ago, "you might as well request the kingdom for him. After all, he is my older brother. Yes, for him and for Abiathar the priest and for Joab, son of Zeruiah." Now, does Adonijah want to be in the company of those two guys? Why does he not want to be in the company of those two guys? Who is Abiathar the priest? We talked about this last week. Yeah, he was the priest, the high priest for King Saul, and he was allowed to come in and remain as high priest. But he was a co-high priest, if you remember, with who? With the other one. Who is Solomon and David's priest? One of the most significant religious figures in all the Bible, because all the rest of the priests are going to come from his line. Zadok, right, Zadok the priest. And so when David is looking for a successor, Adonijah claims the throne, and who goes with him? Abiathar. And Zadok stays loyal to David and to Solomon. And so what do you think the future holds for Abiathar? What's that? It looks bad. It ain't looking too good. We're going to see it in just a minute. What do we know already about Joab that's been commanded from David? He's going to die. And so when Solomon places Adonijah squarely in the category of those two people, what do you think is going to happen to Adonijah? Yeah, doesn't look good, right? So he's sort of taken aback. Personal opinion, and Michael discusses this in the book if you want to read more about it. Do you think that Bathsheba was ignorant enough to know that Solomon was not going to react this way? I think she knew that was the reaction. And you can imagine the mother of the king with a throne that's contested. She may have been okay with the fact that she knew that Adonijah was making a fatal mistake. She didn't argue with him. She didn't say, you know what the consequences of that will be. She said, you asked me to ask him, I'll ask him. And so Bathsheba goes in and does that. Verse 23, King Solomon swore by the Lord, may God deal with me, may it be ever so severely, if Adonijah does not pay with his life for this request. Now as surely as the Lord lives, he who has established me securely on the throne of my father David, and has founded a dynasty for me as he promised, Adonijah shall be put to death today. So King Solomon gave the orders to Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, and he struck down Adonijah, and he died. By the way, who was Benaiah again? This is important to remember. He's going to be our assassin for the remainder of this chapter. But who was he? Sort of, yes. But he was in charge of a particular group of people. Anybody remember? Yeah, he was in charge of David's inner guard. Think of it like David's secret service. People that David brought in to protect him, and it was led by Benaiah. What's the interesting thing about that inner guard, though, that secret service? They were not Israelites. And you need to remember that. And why is it significant, then, for somebody who's not an Israelite to come in and lead an army of mercenaries to protect the king? What's a mercenary interested in? Money. And so they're not interested in political influence. They're not interested in the kingdom. They're not interested in taking sides in political battles. And so the king surrounded himself with foreign mercenaries because the one thing that he had was plenty of money to pay them. And so Benaiah, who's going to end up being very loyal to the king, initially came in as a foreign mercenary, and he's the leader of the secret service for David and Solomon. So King Solomon gave the orders in verse 25, and he struck down Adonijah, and he died. It's a sad story for a lot of reasons. To be a child of David was often to be involved in turmoil. We've already talked about the story of Amnon and Tamar. We've talked about the story of Absalom, and here we see Adonijah lose his life as well. And it's all for that desire for power. Yes.
What's so strange about this is when Bathsheba comes to him and says, I have a favor, do not refuse me. And he says, I will not refuse you. He said, ask and I will not refuse. Well, I'd call murder the absolute refusal.
Yeah, definitely. I don't think he could have predicted what that request was going to be, right? He's almost blown away by the boldness of it. Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. Any other comments or questions on that?
Just in general, you said about David ordered the murder of 3 people, and then we've got these deaths here. When Solomon killed Haggai, was that murder? I'm taking exception with murder when you read these narratives. In some cases, we would use the term he had it coming.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and that was probably a poor choice of words on my part. I wouldn't say that these are murders. I think these are executions for political crimes and for treasonous crimes. So I'm glad you pointed that out. I am not making the statement that Solomon is a murderer. I am making the statement, I believe, that Solomon is taking out vengeance for his father. Does that clear that up some? Thank you for pointing that out. But it's going to be a lot of it going on here, right? This is going to be some bloody stuff here. So Adonijah is gone. That's one person. To Abiathar the priest, the king said, "Go back to your fields," and I have trouble with this word, Anathoth. "You deserve to die, but I will not put you to death now because you carried the ark of the sovereign, shared all my father's hardship." So Solomon removed Abiathar from the priesthood of the Lord, fulfilling the word of the Lord, fulfilling the word the Lord had spoken at Shiloh about the house of Eli. Now this is significant too. So Abiathar is not going to be executed. Why? Because he carried the Ark of the Covenant. That's the reason. And because of his loyalty to David, but mainly because he carried the Ark of the Covenant. Now, this is so interesting too. If you go back and you remember, we talked about this in a lesson, I don't know, it's been a few months ago, about Eli. Who was Eli? He was a priest. And who is he associated with? Samuel. It was Samuel who grew up in the house of Eli, and Eli raised him. But Eli's sons committed crimes and treason against God. And so God made this declaration that Eli's family would not continue to be priests. Well, that's finally comes full circle here at the beginning of 1 Kings with Abiathar, who is the grandson, I believe, of Eli's sons. I have to go back and look at that lineage, but I think he is the grandson of one of Eli's sons. And this is the end of their priestly line in here when Abiathar is removed from service. And he goes to live, this place here, Anathoth, however you want to pronounce it, is a place essentially that was for retired priests. That those who were no longer involved in the priestly service had to go and live in this place. And so that's where he goes. And verse 28, when the news reached Joab, who had conspired with Adonijah, though not with Absalom, he fled to the tent of the Lord and took hold of the horns of the altar. So let's talk about Joab for a minute. And I had a PowerPoint on Joab that we used one time. I'll try to bring it next week. Joab. We know about Joab. What was the first murder that he committed? Abner. Now, we don't have time to go back and rehash that whole story. Abner was not loyal to King David, and so Joab killed Abner in the service of David. So why is he being punished for that? Did it during peace, and he was told not to. And if you remember, David is the one that makes that proclamation the day that Abner dies, that today a good man has died in Israel. That Abner had the respect of David, and he did not want him murdered. He was one of the commanders of the army, but he sided with Saul. We'll go back and look at it. If you'll remind me, we'll go back and look at that story next week. It's been a while since I've looked at that myself. The second was Amasa. Amasa was also a commander that was killed in peacetime, and Joab murdered him. And Joab also was responsible for the death of who, most significantly? Absalom. He was the one that orchestrated Absalom's killing, and so that's the reason that he's punished here. But so it's interesting. Joab goes, and it's Joab who had conspired with Adonijah. He goes and he says, "I'm going to take hold of the horns of the altar." He's worked for Adonijah. It's going to work for me. King Solomon was told that Joab had fled to the tent of the Lord and was beside the altar. And then Solomon ordered Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, there's our assassin again, go strike him down. So Benaiah entered the tent of the Lord and said to Joab, "The king says, 'Come out.' But he answered, 'No, I will die here.' Benaiah reported this to the king. 'This is how Joab answered me.' And the king commanded Benaiah, 'Do as he says, strike him down and bury him, and so clear me and my whole family of the guilt of the innocent blood that Joab shed. The Lord will repay him for the blood he shed, because without my father David knowing it, he attacked 2 men and killed them with the sword, Abner and Amasa. And verse 33, may the guilt of their blood rest on the head of Joab and his descendants forever, but on David and his descendants, his house and his throne, may there be the Lord's peace forever. So Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, went up and struck down Joab and killed him, and he was buried at his home out in the country. And so Joab is killed here. Now, there is, and this is not going to be of interest really to anybody, but there was legal precedent for killing Joab, even though he was on the horns of the altar, because Joab, and I try to put it this way, who served in the military? Military people here? Are there rules of engagement in war? Wouldn't you say so? There's this piece of paper that a lot of people signed one time. Remember what it's called? It was signed in Switzerland. The Geneva Convention, anybody remember that? Okay. So would we say there's rules of engagement? Yes. And even if you commit an act of war in service of your country, if it violates those rules of engagement, what will happen to you? Court-martial, right? Army people, help me out here. Am I right? I've never been in active duty, so I can't say, but I know there's consequences. Is that right, Bob? Eric, that right? Okay, so that's essentially what goes on here. Joab, even though he had done these things in the service of David, he had done them in ways that were, as was mentioned, in peacetime, and which violated those rules that were set forth for war. And so he had no call and no ability to go and declare peace on the horns of the day. He was essentially a war criminal, and Solomon was clearing his family's name of that innocent blood. And so Benaiah kills him, and then he is actually placed in his position. He is now in charge of the entire army, which is significant that a foreigner is put in charge of the entire army. Joab is family. Do you remember? Joab is related to David, but here they put a foreign mercenary in charge of the army. That's pretty significant. So Benaiah is put in charge of the army, and then Abiathar is replaced with Zadok. And so now Zadok, who was loyal to David, Benaiah, who was loyal to David, they're in all these positions. But there's still one piece of unfinished business, right? Abiathar's been dealt with. Adonijah has been dealt with. Joab has been dealt with. Who's the one person left that he was instructed to take care of by David? Shimei, right? And there's lots of different ways to say his name too. But he calls for Shimei. Now what did David instruct him to do? You remember? Don't let what? Don't let his gray hair go down in peace, right? So he was told to kill him. But listen, the king sent for Shimei and said to him, build yourself a house in Jerusalem and live there, but do not go anywhere else. By the way, Shimei was probably an important businessman. He was essentially quarantined, which is the word we're hearing a lot today, to Jerusalem. Now, what is significant about the size of Jerusalem at this time? When you think about Jerusalem in Israel, what do you think about? You think about it being a big place or a small place? We think about a big place, right? It's the New York of the Middle East in this time. In this day and age, Jerusalem, the entire city is about 11 acres. There's probably 2,000 to 3,000 people that live there. It's a teeny tiny place. And Shimei is a wealthy businessman, and so he's told, build a house in Israel, but the day you leave and cross the Kidron Valley, verse 37, you can be sure you will die. Your blood will be on your own head. And so Shimei agrees, but in verse 39, 3 years later, 2 of his slaves ran off to Achish, and it names them. And this, he saddled, in verse 40, his donkey and went to Achish at Gath in search of his slaves. So Shimei went away and brought back his slaves from Gath. And when Solomon was told that he'd gone, he goes through and he's essentially waiting on him to come back. You get to verse 44. The king also said to Shimei, you know in your heart all the wrong you did to my father David. Now the Lord will repay you for your wrongdoing, but King Solomon will be blessed, and David's throne will remain secure before the Lord forever. And the king gave the order to Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, and he went out and struck Shimei down, and he died. Benaiah is busy in this chapter, by the way, right? You notice that? And the kingdom was now established in Solomon's hands. So a lot's happened here. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, done away with edged weapons. So we see Shimei and Joab, per David's instructions, have both been killed. Abiathar's been removed from the priestly line, and Adonijah has been removed. So now everything is set up for Solomon to truly be the king. This is, anybody ever watched the movie The Godfather? Remember the end of it, the end of the first Godfather movie? There's this very epic scene where Michael Corleone is in the church, and they're christening this baby, and they say, all the works of Satan, do you renounce them? I do renounce them. And in the background, he's going and killing all the heads of the other mafia families. This is not exactly like that, but this is kind of like that. He's taking care of all the unfinished business from David so that he will no longer have any enemies and that the throne will be his. And it's important to realize he's doing all this with the approval of King David, and thus he's doing it with God's approval. And so Solomon here has finally taken care of all that, and then we're going to get to chapter 3, and Solomon is now the king. His enemies have been taken care of, and now it's time for him to get to work. And what is his first order of business going to be? Anybody remember? Building a temple, right? So we're going to see that, but in chapter 3, he's going to do something that leads up to that we'll talk about a little bit next week. All right, I know that's a lot of names, a lot going on, but go through and read that, spend some time. There's a lot of interesting details and stories here about Israelite history. Questions or comments? All right, everybody go wash your hands.